Hi, dear friend, I'm Dorothy, and the story I'm about to tell isn't one of fairy tales, but of a real life, with its losses and reunions. I've lived through many things, and sometimes I wonder, how did I get here? How did a woman who once found herself alone, with no one to turn to, end up here, with a smile and a lighter soul? Well, my story is full of secrets kept, of pain, of wrong choices, but also of love, redemption, and a new beginning I never imagined I would have. Sometimes, life feels like a road full of twists and turns, but in the end, we find what we've always been looking for. And we find ourselves, and maybe you, too, are there, looking for something that got lost along the way. But before we continue this journey, I want to know, where are you watching us from? Comment below and tell me which city you're following this story from, because, every place has its own charm and maybe something you've already lived through. And please, stay until the end, because a lifetime story can't be told in just a few minutes. And who knows what you'll discover, right? Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to come, and I'd love to have you with me as we go down this path together. Now, hold my hand, dear, and come with me. This is my story. But maybe, just maybe, it's yours too. Dorothy's life had always been quiet, simple even. She lived alone in a small blue house with only her cats for company, their soft purring filling the empty spaces of the house. The walls, lined with memories of a life lived, had witnessed her joys and sorrows. And at the center of it all, there was Charlie, her late husband, whose laughter seemed to still echo through the rooms, even after so many years of silence. She never felt truly alone. After all, the memories were always there, keeping her company. Every morning, Dorothy would wake up early, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the curtains and casting a golden glow over the small, cozy kitchen. She would brew a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the air, and sit by the window, watching the world go by at its own pace. The world outside, with its hustle and bustle, felt distant from the peaceful rhythm of her life. She was content with her own company, finding comfort in the little things: her morning routine, the sound of the birds outside, the rustle of the leaves in the wind. It was a life she had come to love. But even in the calm of her everyday life, there was an undercurrent, a nagging feeling that something was missing. She had lived through many years and many experiences, but she knew, deep down, that something was about to change. Maybe it was the age that was catching up with her, or maybe it was the small, almost imperceptible shifts in the wind that whispered of a storm on the horizon. Whatever it was, Dorothy could feel that the peaceful life she had built was about to be tested in ways she could not yet understand. It started as just another typical day, the kind Dorothy had grown accustomed to. The sun was bright, the breeze soft, and the world felt so at peace. She couldn't imagine anything disturbing the tranquility. But, as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the very sky was holding its breath. Dorothy, ever so in tune with the world around her, noticed the shift. She was no stranger to storms after all. She had lived through many in her time. But there was something different this time. The first warning came from the radio, crackling with an urgent tone, a voice telling people to prepare for the approaching storm. A tornado had been detected nearby. Dorothy's old heart skipped a beat, but she wasn't quick to panic. She had seen these things before, and usually, they passed without much more than a little rain and some wind. Still, something about the way the announcer spoke unsettled her. This wasn't just any storm. This was bigger, stronger, the kind of storm that changes lives. But even then, Dorothy felt no real urgency. She went about her day, moving slowly and methodically, as she always did. She made sure the windows were secure, the doors locked, and her cats were safely indoors. She didn't rush. After all, what was the point of worrying when she had no control over the storm? And, in truth, she wasn't one to be easily shaken. Life had taught her that storms, both literal and figurative, pass. And so, she waited, listening to the radio, watching the sky, and trusting in the calm that had served her so well all these years. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. As the day wore on, the sky seemed to darken, and the familiar peace of Dorothy's life began to fade. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with an unsettling intensity. Dorothy stood by the window, her hands pressed against the cold glass, watching the sky turn a deep, threatening gray. She knew, without a doubt, that the storm was coming. The air felt heavy, as if it were charged with an electric current that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The birds had gone silent, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the storm to make its move. At first, Dorothy tried to convince herself that it would pass. After all, storms were a part of life. But as the wind howled louder and the first raindrops began to fall, she couldn't ignore the rising sense of unease in her chest. She had lived through hurricanes, blizzards, and thunderstorms. But there was something about this storm that felt different. It was as if the sky itself was angry, a force of nature determined to take what it could. Dorothy could feel it in her bones, the shift in the atmosphere, the growing tension that only someone who had seen as much as she had could recognize. Her heart began to race as the first clap of thunder shook the house, rattling the windows and sending her cats scattering into hiding. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but a wave of panic surged through her. She had faced many challenges in her life, but this storm, this force of nature, felt like something she couldn't control. The power of it was almost suffocating, and for the first time in a long time, Dorothy was afraid. She turned away from the window and made her way down to the basement, her mind racing. The house, the life she had built, could be gone in an instant. There was nothing she could do to stop it. As Dorothy descended the narrow steps into the basement, a wave of nostalgia swept over her. The basement, like the rest of the house, was filled with remnants of a life well lived. Boxers filled with old photographs, letters, and mementos of a time long past. She paused for a moment, her fingers brushing against an old wooden chest that had belonged to Charlie. His presence was everywhere, in every corner, in every dust-covered item. It was as if, even in the face of this impending disaster, his spirit remained with her, offering a strange sense of comfort. But that comfort was fleeting. The house above her was starting to groan under the force of the storm, and Dorothy knew that the true threat was just beginning. She sat down on an old wooden chair, holding her knees tightly against her chest. The storm outside raged on, the winds howling and the rain pounding against the windows. The sounds were deafening, but in the basement there was an eerie calm. It was a calm that reminded her of the stillness before a major shift, like the silence before a great storm in her life. She had experienced that before, so many times. As the wind began to howl even louder, Dorothy's thoughts drifted back to the years when life felt simpler, when she and Charlie had lived here, laughing together in this very house, their lives intertwined with love and hope for the future. Now, all she had were the memories, the photographs of their trips, the little notes he had left for her, all things that would soon be reduced to rubble. The storm outside was an unstoppable force, and she had no choice but to wait, holding on to the memories as though they were all she had left. The storm raged on through the night, its fury unrelenting. Dorothy had clung to her memories, to the small comforts she could find in the chaos of the storm. But when the morning came, the world outside was unrecognizable. The winds had torn through the neighborhood, leaving behind nothing but destruction. Dorothy cautiously made her way upstairs, her heart heavy, bracing for what she knew she would find. As she stepped outside, the full extent of the damage became clear. The house she had spent decades building her sanctuary, her home was no more. The roof had been torn off, the walls reduced to rubble, and the once pristine garden was now a tangle of broken branches and debris. The small blue house that had been the backdrop of her life was now unrecognizable, a pile of shattered memories. Dorothy stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend the scene in front of her. It was as if the storm had taken everything from her in one swift, brutal strike. The reality of the destruction hit her like a physical blow. She could hardly believe it. How could everything she had worked so hard for, everything that had given her life meaning, be gone in the blink of an eye? The silence that followed the storm was deafening. There were no birds singing, no sounds of laughter, no children playing, just the cold, harsh reality of loss. Dorothy stood there, her face a mixture of disbelief and grief, as she realized that her life, as she had known it, had been wiped away in an instant. The days following the storm were long and heavy. Dorothy couldn't bring herself to leave the ruins of her home, as if staying among the wreckage would somehow keep the memories alive. Everything had changed in an instant, and yet, somehow, nothing felt real. She wandered through the debris, her eyes vacant, as if waiting for someone to tell her this wasn't happening, that it was all just a bad dream. The neighbors offered help, of course, but it all felt so foreign to her. They spoke in concerned tones, offered to take her to a shelter, but Dorothy knew she couldn't go. The shelter was filled with strangers, and she had spent so many years in solitude. The thought of being surrounded by unfamiliar faces only made her feel more isolated. What she needed wasn't sympathy or pity, it was the quiet peace she had always known. The solitude that, despite everything, had always been her refuge. As the days passed, Dorothy sank deeper into herself. She missed Charlie more than ever, the absence of his voice, his laughter, his presence. It was as though the storm had taken him from her all over again. The house, which had once been a symbol of their life together, now felt like a tomb. The memories seemed to haunt her more than the storm itself. She spent hours sitting in the dark, staring at the photographs, running her fingers over the trinkets and mementos that now felt like they belonged to someone else. She wondered how she could have been so careless with the one thing that truly mattered. How could she have spent so many years lost in the comfort of routine, not realizing that everything was fragile, everything was fleeting? As the days dragged on and the weight of the tragedy settled deeper into her bones, Dorothy found herself holding on to a fragile thread of hope. Her son, David. He was the only family she had left, and the thought of him brought her a strange sense of comfort. She hadn't seen him in years, not since he had moved away, but in the wake of the storm, she couldn't shake the thought that he might help her, that he might come to her rescue. With trembling hands, Dorothy picked up the phone, her fingers brushing the worn buttons as if they were a lifeline to something familiar, something she could hold on to. She hesitated for a moment before dialing David's number, wondering what to say, how to ask for help after so much time apart. The phone rang several times before the familiar voice on the other end answered. David sounded surprised to hear from her, his tone colder than she remembered. "Mom," he said, his voice distant, as though he had to mentally shift gears before fully understanding what she was asking. "What's going on?" I didn't expect you to call." Dorothy felt a pang in her chest. She had hoped for warmth, for some recognition of the years they had spent apart. But instead, his voice was distant, disconnected. Still, she held on to her hope. "I need your help, David. My house, it's gone. Everything is gone. And I don't know what to do." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and Dorothy's heart sank as she waited for David's response. She could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind, calculating the effort, the inconvenience, the cost of coming to her aid. She wondered, as she had so many times before, whether he truly cared, or if his concern was just out of obligation. "All right, Mom," David finally said, his voice stiff. "I'll figure something out, but you'll need to stay in a shelter for now. It's the best option for you." Dorothy's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected warmth or understanding, but she had hoped for more than this, more than a mere obligation. He wasn't coming to her, wasn't offering comfort. He was sending her away. She felt small, insignificant, as though she were just a burden to him, something to be dealt with and forgotten as quickly as possible. Her heart ached. How did her own son become so distant? The drive to David's house felt longer than it actually was. Dorothy stared out the window, watching the landscape shift from the familiar sights of her small town to the sterile, manicured streets of the city. Her heart was heavy with the anticipation of seeing her son after so many years, but also filled with a sense of unease. She didn't know what to expect, and deep down, she feared that the gap between them had grown too wide to bridge. When they finally arrived at David's house, Dorothy was taken aback by how different it all seemed. The house was large, gleaming, and cold, a far cry from the warm, cozy home she had once known. It stood tall, like a fortress, surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges and a freshly paved driveway. Dorothy stood in front of it, feeling small, as though she didn't belong. There was a sharp contrast between the grandeur of David's life and the humble simplicity of her own. She felt out of place, as if she were an outsider, visiting a world she no longer recognized. David greeted her with a quick hug, his arms stiff, and then ushered her inside with the same detachment she had heard in his voice earlier. The house was beautiful, too beautiful, almost like a showpiece. Everything was pristine and perfectly arranged, with expensive furniture and decor that seemed to mock her worn-out jeans and tired face. Dorothy couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. She had never cared about luxury or material things, but standing in David's home, she realized just how much things had changed. The warmth of family had been replaced by the coldness of wealth. She was struck by how quiet it was. There were no children running around, no laughter echoing through the halls, only the faint sound of a television in the background. Emma, David's wife, was nowhere to be found, and Dorothy felt a growing discomfort settle in her chest. As she followed David through the large hallways, she wondered if she was even welcome here, or if this was just a place to put her until the next step could be figured out. Dorothy hadn't been in David's house long before she met Emma, his wife. She appeared in the doorway of the living room, her gaze cool and calculating, as if assessing Dorothy not with concern, but with judgment. Emma's smile, though polite, didn't reach her eyes. There was something about the way she looked at Dorothy that felt almost dismissive. "Hello," Emma said, her tone flat and formal, as if they were mere acquaintances rather than family. She didn't extend her hand, didn't offer to sit down, simply stood there, her arms crossed. "I hope you're doing okay after everything," Dorothy nodded, trying to ignore the coldness in Emma's words. She had expected some discomfort, sure, but she hadn't expected it to be so blatant, so sharp. She could feel Emma's eyes on her, judging her every movement, as if she were an intruder in her own son's home. Dorothy had never been one to play the part of a guest. She wasn't a stranger here. This was still her family. Or, at least, it was supposed to be. "I'm fine, thank you," Dorothy replied, her voice steady, though the weight of Emma's cold stare made her feel smaller than she was. I wasn't sure where else to go." Emma's expression remained unchanged, but Dorothy could feel the tension rising in the room. It wasn't just the house that was cold, but the people inside it. Emma didn't seem to want her there, and Dorothy could sense that her presence was an inconvenience to her. She felt like an unwelcome guest, a burden that had to be tolerated rather than embraced. The warmth, the family connection she had hoped for, seemed to evaporate with every passing moment. David didn't seem to notice the tension. He was busy talking about mundane things, giving Dorothy instructions on where she could rest and what she could do, as if everything was perfectly fine. But Dorothy wasn't fooled. She knew that something had changed between them, between her and David, and between her and Emma. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt the invisible walls rising, one by one. That evening, as the house settled into an uncomfortable silence, Dorothy couldn't shake the growing sense of isolation. She had hoped that, after everything, her son would be there for her, would offer a sense of warmth and security in the face of everything she had lost, but instead, David seemed more concerned with maintaining the appearance of normalcy than offering any real comfort. The distance between them had grown, and she could feel it like a thick fog in the air. After dinner, as they sat in the spacious living room, David looked at her with an air of finality. "Mom, I know this is hard, but you'll have to understand. I can't just uproot my life for you. I have a family now, and Emma and I need our space." His voice was calm, too calm, and his words hit Dorothy like a slap to the face. She blinked, stunned, struggling to process what he had just said. "David, I lost everything. I need your help," Dorothy said, her voice trembling, but still filled with a quiet strength. "I'm your mother, and you're the only one I have left. How can you turn your back on me like this?" David's face hardened. "I'm not turning my back on you, but I can't sacrifice everything for you either. You're going to have to figure things out. Maybe you could stay in a shelter for a while. It's the best I can do." Dorothy felt the weight of his words crush her. The love, the connection they once shared, seemed to have disappeared entirely. She wasn't just a mother in need of comfort. She was an inconvenience to him, a problem he didn't want to deal with. The rejection stung deeper than she could have imagined. How had things become so cold between them? How had her son, the boy she raised with so much love and sacrifice, turned into this stranger sitting before her, so dismissive, so uninterested in her pain? "Fine," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "I understand." She stood up from her chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She couldn't stay here, not like this, not in a house that felt more like a prison than a refuge. The loneliness, the rejection, were too much to bear. As she walked toward the door, she heard David's voice faintly behind her, but she didn't turn back. There was nothing left to say. The night was long, colder than Dorothy had expected, and the silence in the car was deafening. She sat in the passenger seat, her back pressed against the worn fabric, staring out the windshield. The world outside was dark, with only the faint glow of streetlights illuminating the empty streets. She could feel the weight of the night pressing in on her, and in that moment, she realized just how alone she truly was. She had nowhere else to go. No family, no friends, no place that felt like home. All she had left was the car, the one thing that could offer a shred of comfort in the midst of this crushing loneliness. The irony wasn't lost on her after all. She had spent so many years building a life, a home, only to find herself here in the dead of night with nothing but her thoughts and the sound of her breathing to keep her company. The car, though small and cramped, became her refuge, the only space where she could find any semblance of peace. It was a strange kind of comfort, but it was all she had. She wrapped herself in a blanket she had found in the back seat, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the ache in her heart. The tears she had been holding back for days finally began to spill, one by one, as she allowed herself to grieve. The loss of her home, the rejection by her son, the realization that she had nowhere to go all hit her at once, and the weight of it nearly broke her. Yet, even as she sat there, crying in the cold night, there was a quiet strength that remained within her. She had been through worse, after all. She had lost so much before, and still managed to find her way. This, too, she would survive. She didn't know how or when, but she knew that the woman who had raised her son, who had built a life from the ground up, was not someone who would let herself be defeated by a single night of despair. She would find a way to rise again. The morning after the long, sleepless night in the car, Dorothy woke up with a sense of heaviness in her chest. The world outside was still asleep, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional distant hum of a passing car. She had spent another night in her old car, parked in a quiet corner of a parking lot. It wasn't the place she had imagined herself in at this stage of life, but it was the reality she now faced. As she sat in the driver's seat, Dorothy felt an unexpected urge to search through the glove compartment. Maybe there was something in there she could use, something that might offer a hint of comfort or direction. She opened it slowly, as if the mere act of rummaging through old papers could somehow offer her a sense of purpose. That's when she found it. It was an old business card, faded and worn, with a name and number scribbled in a shaky, almost forgotten handwriting. The card was a reminder of a time long ago, of a love she had once known, Robert, her first love. The name on the card had remained with her all these years, even though she had never been brave enough to reach out. There had been too many reasons, life, responsibilities, and the choices she had made along the way. But now, in the face of everything she had lost, Dorothy wondered if it might be time to take a step she had never dared to take. She ran her fingers over the card, feeling the worn edges, the ink that had begun to fade. It felt like a lifeline, a connection to something from a time before all the hurt and loss. She thought of Robert, of the warmth in his eyes, the smile that had once made her feel seen and loved. Would he remember her? Would he even want to hear from her after all these years? The doubts crept in, but Dorothy silenced them quickly. What did she have to lose? She was already lost, after all. With a deep breath, Dorothy picked up the phone. Her hands trembled slightly, but she dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, and for the first time in a long while, Dorothy felt a flicker of hope. The phone rang once, twice, and Dorothy's heart pounded in her chest. She felt a rush of nervousness, a knot forming in her stomach, as the familiar sound echoed in the quiet of the car. Was this a mistake? After all these years, did she really have the right to call Robert? What if he had moved on, had his own life? The thought almost made her hang up, but then, a small voice inside her, the same one that had guided her through years of hardship, reminded her that she had nothing to lose. After everything, after losing her home, her son's love, and her place in the world, this was her chance for a new beginning, no matter how uncertain it seemed. The phone rang again, and finally, a voice answered on the other end. It was deep and warm, instantly familiar. Hello. Robert's voice echoed through the line, and for a moment, Dorothy forgot how to speak. It had been so many years. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't quite believe it. After all the time, all the years that had passed between them, there he was, his voice still carrying the same warmth she remembered. Robert. Dorothy's voice trembled, as if she were testing the waters of a dream. It's Dorothy. There was a long silence, the kind that made Dorothy's heart race. She held her breath, wondering if he would hang up, or if he even remembered her. And then, just when she thought she might lose her nerve, Robert spoke, his voice softer this time. Dorothy, I can't believe it's really you. After all these years, double quotes. The years seemed to melt away in that moment. Dorothy felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a connection. It was the same warmth she had once felt, that sense of being understood, of being seen for who she truly was. Her heart skipped a beat as she listened to Robert's voice, knowing that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. When Dorothy heard Robert's voice again, it was as if time had bent itself in half, pulling them both back to a moment long ago. The years that had separated them decades even seemed to disappear. It was as though they were both standing together once more, young and full of life, without the weight of all that had come after. "How have you been, Dorothy?" Robert asked, his voice tender, with a hint of nostalgia. Dorothy closed her eyes, imagining the warmth of his hand on hers, the way they used to sit by the lake, talking about their hopes and dreams. How had it been so long since they'd last spoken? Her chest tightened with emotion, and she blinked back tears. I've had my share of troubles," Dorothy replied softly, her voice steady despite the swell of feelings inside her. "But, Robert, I found your number. After everything that's happened, I thought, maybe you'd still want to hear from me." For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line, and Dorothy feared that she might have made a mistake. Had it been too long? Was he angry? She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't the moment of silence that filled the space between them. Then Robert spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Dorothy, I never stopped thinking about you. When you left, I never wanted you to go. I made so many mistakes, but I always wondered what could have been." Hearing these words, Dorothy felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. She had carried so much regret, so many questions, but in that moment, all of it seemed to dissolve. Robert hadn't forgotten her, and in some way, maybe she hadn't forgotten him either. "I've missed you, Robert," she whispered, her voice cracking just a little. "I don't know what this means, but I wanted to hear your voice again." "I've missed you too," Robert replied, his voice tender. "It's not too late, Dorothy. It's never too late." Dorothy closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her, feeling the warmth of hope flicker in her heart. She didn't know what would come of this unexpected reunion, but for the first time in years, she felt like the past still held a future. The moment Dorothy arrived at the parking lot, the weight of everything she had been through seemed to catch up with her. Her body felt heavy, as though the past few days had drained every last bit of strength from her. Yet, despite her exhaustion, there was a spark of excitement deep inside her chest. She had never imagined that, after all these years, she would be meeting Robert again. But here she was, standing in the same parking lot where they had last said goodbye, waiting for him to arrive. The wind was cool against her skin, and the world around her seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if waiting for the moment to arrive. And then, she saw him. Robert's figure appeared at the entrance of the parking lot, walking slowly towards her, his steps purposeful, yet gentle, as if he, too, was trying to process the enormity of this reunion. When their eyes met, a wave of recognition washed over her, and Dorothy's heart skipped a beat. He was older, of course, his hair now touched with gray, and his face lined with the years they had both lived. But there was something about the way he moved, something familiar and comforting, that made Dorothy feel like she was seeing the man she had once loved. The world around them faded away as Robert closed the distance between them, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dorothy," he said softly, almost as though he were afraid that if he spoke too loudly, the moment would shatter. And in that instant, Dorothy knew, without a doubt, that this was not just some fleeting encounter. This was something real, something deeper than either of them had imagined. Without another word, Robert reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. The touch was so tender, so full of years of unspoken emotions, that Dorothy couldn't help but close her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hands against her skin. "You haven't changed, Dorothy. You're still the woman I loved." Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes, and for the first time in so long, she felt truly seen. She had never expected this moment, but now that it was here, it was everything she had hoped for. The years apart had been long and painful, but here they were, together again, and in that moment, everything that had been lost seemed worth it. The air between them seemed to pulse with the weight of all the years, all the regrets, and all the unspoken things they had carried in their hearts. Robert's hands lingered on Dorothy's face for just a moment longer, as if afraid to let go. The world around them was quiet, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of their story to unfold. And then, Robert spoke, his voice low and steady. "You still are beautiful, Dorothy." The words landed softly, but they struck her deep within her soul. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way he said them, the way he looked at her, as though nothing had changed. as though the years had not marred the connection they once shared. Dorothy felt something shift within her. It wasn't just the affirmation of her beauty, it was the acknowledgement of her worth, of the love they had shared, of the person she wasn't had always been in his eyes. For a moment, Dorothy couldn't find her voice. The emotion she had buried for so long rose up inside her like a tidal wave. Her eyes filled with tears, and she swallowed hard, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, to speak or to remain silent. She had never expected this, had never imagined that after everything, she would find herself standing here, hearing these words, so simple yet so profound, from the man she had once loved. You still think that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert smiled softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never stopped thinking it. I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful. In that moment, everything that had been lost in the years apart seemed to fade away. The pain, the heartache, the regrets, it all melted in the warmth of those 3 words. "You still are beautiful." And just like that, Dorothy felt as though she had been given a new beginning, a chance to rewrite the story of her life. Robert's house stood in stark contrast to everything Dorothy had known. It was vast, a mansion that gleamed with the polish of wealth, the kind of home Dorothy had only ever seen in magazines or on television. Yet, as they pulled up the long, winding driveway, Dorothy couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and discomfort. The place felt imposing, cold in its grandeur, and Dorothy suddenly wondered if she truly belonged here. Robert had lived a life she had never known, one that was filled with luxury and privilege, the very things she had never sought for herself. She had always valued simplicity, the warmth of a small home, the closeness of family and friends. But here she was, about to enter a world she was unaccustomed to. As Robert led her through the front door, the sheer size of the space made her feel like an intruder. The foyer was grand, with high ceilings and marble floors that gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers. The furniture was expensive, the decor impeccable. It was beautiful, yes, but Dorothy couldn't help but feel out of place. The house, despite its beauty, felt cold, almost sterile, like a museum of wealth, devoid of warmth and lived-in comfort. But Robert seemed to fit in here, moving through the house with ease, as though he had always belonged. As Dorothy followed him through the long hallways, her eyes were drawn to the photographs that adorned the walls, pictures of Robert, his family, his life. It was all so different from what she had known, but somehow, it felt familiar too. She could see in Robert's eyes, in the way he moved, that this was his home. It was his world. When they reached the living room, Robert turned to her and smiled warmly. "Make yourself at home," he said, his voice filled with affection. Dorothy nodded, but as she sank into the plush armchair, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was a visitor, not just in his house, but in a life that was so foreign to her. The night stretched on, and Dorothy and Robert found themselves sitting by the fireplace, the warmth of the crackling fire offering some relief from the chill that had settled in the house. It was quiet now, just the 2 of them, and for the first time in so many years, Dorothy felt a sense of peace, unfamiliar, yet welcome feeling. As they spoke, the conversation moved from the past to the present, touching on old memories, the choices they had made, and the lives they had lived since they last saw each other. The years melted away with each shared story, and for a while, it was as though they had never been apart. Robert spoke of his career, his travels, the life he had built. Dorothy, in turn, spoke of the years she had spent raising David, the heartbreaks, the sacrifices, and the quiet joys that had come with her simpler life. "It's strange," Dorothy said softly, her voice tinged with melancholy. "I spent so many years wondering what could have been, what our lives might have looked like if we had stayed together. But then I had David, and I thought, maybe I was meant to focus on him, to build a life for him." Robert nodded, his eyes reflecting understanding. "I thought the same, Dorothy. I thought about you every day, and I wondered if I had made the right choice. But life doesn't always give us the answers we want. It's hard to look back and know if we could have done things differently." Dorothy smiled faintly, a bitter edge to her expression. "I don't know if I would have changed anything. I loved David, and I tried to give him everything. But in the end, maybe I gave too much of myself. I don't know. Maybe I should have fought harder for us." "You loved him, and that's all you could do," Robert said gently. "You gave everything for him. And sometimes, that's the only thing we can do in life, love the best we can. Even when it's hard." There was a pause between them, a comfortable silence that hung in the air like a soft melody. It wasn't that everything was perfect, or that all the wounds had healed, but in that moment, Dorothy felt as though she had found a kindred spirit in Robert, someone who understood her without words, someone who knew what it was like to love deeply and lose just as fiercely. The evening was quiet, the kind of peaceful night that came only after a long day of heart-to-heart conversations. Dorothy and Robert sat down for dinner in the grand dining room, the large table set with fine china, the soft glow of candlelight casting shadows across the room. It was the kind of dinner Dorothy had never imagined herself having, surrounded by wealth and opulence, but with the comfort of an old friend who knew her as well as Robert did. As they ate, the conversation took a more personal turn. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying Dorothy with a tenderness that made her heart flutter, and then he spoke, his voice softer than usual. "You know, Dorothy, I've never married," he said, almost as an afterthought, as though it had never been something he had needed to explain before. Dorothy looked up at him, surprised. "Never, but why?" Robert hesitated, his eyes drifting to the candle in the center of the table, as if searching for the right words. When he looked back at her, his gaze was full of honesty. "Because I never got over you, Dorothy. After you left, I couldn't bring myself to love anyone else. Not the way I loved you. I thought about you all the time, wondering what could have been. I never truly moved on." Dorothy's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected him to say such things, especially not after all these years. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she felt like the weight of the past had lifted from her shoulders. I never knew that," Dorothy whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I always wondered if you ever thought of me, if you ever regretted what happened between us." Robert reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. "I never stopped thinking about you, Dorothy. And no, I don't regret anything, because it brought me here, to this moment with you. But if I could go back, I would have fought harder for us. I would have never let you go." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning, and Dorothy felt her heart swell with a mix of emotions: sadness for the years lost, but also something more, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long: hope. The evening had felt like a dream, one Dorothy wasn't sure she was ready to wake up from. The warmth between her and Robert had rekindled something she had long since buried, a feeling of being cherished, of being loved. It was hard to reconcile the luxury of Robert's home with the pain of losing so much, but in this moment, it felt as though she was finally being seen, truly seen, after all these years. Just as Dorothy was beginning to relax, the shrill sound of her phone broke the quiet. She glanced at the screen and saw David's name flashing across it. A pang of unease settled in her stomach. She had barely spoken to him since she left his house, and after the cold reception she had received, she wasn't sure she wanted to speak with him at all. But she answered the call anyway, her heart racing with the uncertainty of what David might say. "Mom," David's voice came through the phone, sounding distant and almost rehearsed. "I heard you were with ... Robert. Is that true?" Dorothy's chest tightened. She hadn't expected David to reach out, especially after their last conversation. She didn't know how to respond, or if she even wanted to. "Yes, David, it's true," Dorothy said, her voice calm, but a bit guarded. "I'm with Robert. He's been kind enough to help me after everything that's happened." David was silent for a moment, and Dorothy could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. Then, his voice took on a different tone, one that was less concerned and more ... calculating. "I don't know, Mom. I mean, I understand you need help, but, Robert, really, I'm just worried about you, okay? You shouldn't be relying on him. I'm your son. I should be the one you turn to." Dorothy felt the familiar sting of rejection, but it was different this time. It was just the dismissive tone in David's voice. It was the undercurrent of something else, something she hadn't noticed before. The way he was speaking to her now felt less like a son concerned for his mother, and more like someone who was trying to control her, to manipulate the situation in his favor. "I am relying on Robert, David, because he's here for me," Dorothy replied firmly, her voice steady, "and I need that right now. I know it's hard for you, but this is my choice." David's voice grew more insistent. "Mom, you don't know what you're doing. He's just using you. You don't even know what he really wants." Dorothy felt her frustration grow. It was as though David's concern wasn't for her well-being, but for something else, something that was his, something he feared he might lose. She could hear it in his words, the thinly veiled jealousy, the need to control what happened to her. I'm not a child, David, Dorothy said, her voice low but firm. I don't need you to tell me what's best for me. I can make my own choices, and I don't need your approval. David's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, and Dorothy knew, without a doubt, that the true nature of his concern wasn't about her well-being. It was about something else, something that wasn't love. After a long pause, David finally spoke again, his voice cold. Fine, do what you want, but don't come running to me when it all falls apart. Dorothy didn't respond. She simply ended the call, her hand shaking slightly as she put the phone down. The silence that followed felt final. There was no reconciliation with David. There was no hope of finding comfort from him. She was truly on her own, and the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. But as she sat in Robert's warm living room, the shadows of the past seemed to fade a little more, and for the first time in a long time, Dorothy didn't feel so alone. Dorothy sat in the quiet of Robert's grand living room, the conversation with David still lingering in the back of her mind. She hadn't expected anything different from him, but hearing the bitterness in his voice stung more than she had anticipated. His words echoed in her head, the insinuation that Robert was somehow using her, that she was making a mistake by leaning on him. But Dorothy knew better. She wasn't naive. Robert had always been a constant in her life, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. Still, the tension lingered, not just from her conversation with David, but in the very air between them. It was subtle, but Dorothy could sense that Robert was now more distant, more guarded. She couldn't blame him. The arrival of David's jealousy had cast a shadow over their reunion. The love they were rekindling was no longer just about them, it was tangled up with David's bitterness, with his need to control, to somehow claim what was his. Robert hadn't said much after the phone call, but Dorothy could tell that he had heard the undercurrent of anger in David's voice. It was a different kind of tension, one that wasn't easily dismissed. The concern David had once shown her seemed to have shifted into something darker, something that resembled greed more than love. A few days later, when Robert was out on one of his many business calls, Dorothy decided to take a walk in the sprawling garden surrounding the house. The silence of the place gave her space to think, but as she wandered down the stone path, her mind kept returning to David's words. She couldn't shake the feeling that her son's concern for her well-being wasn't genuine anymore. It was as though he was more concerned with what Robert represented: the wealth, the status, the attention he might lose. It wasn't about her, it was about him. And then it hit her. David wasn't worried about her at all. He wasn't concerned for her safety or her happiness. No, this was about something else, something deeper. It was about control. He wanted to control her, to make her feel like she owed him something. Dorothy stopped in her tracks, the weight of the realization sinking in. For years, she had been bending over backward, trying to keep her family together, trying to maintain her relationship with David, but it had always been one-sided. Now, with Robert, she saw something different. She saw what it was like to be truly cared for, to be seen as more than just a means to an end. As Dorothy walked back to the house, she felt a quiet sense of resolve settling within her. She wasn't going to let David manipulate her anymore. She wasn't going to let him control her happiness, her choices, or her future. The days passed, and Dorothy felt herself slowly settling into the rhythm of Robert's life. The mansion, though still overwhelming in its opulence, felt less like a foreign world with each passing day. The time they spent together was filled with warmth, long conversations by the fire, quiet walks through the gardens, and moments of shared understanding that made Dorothy feel like she had finally found a place where she belonged. It was a feeling she hadn't known in so many years. Despite all the comforts and luxuries that Robert had to offer, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She wasn't used to grandeur, to the overwhelming excess that surrounded her. What she longed for, more than anything, was simplicity. A life that was grounded, real, and true to what mattered most: love, connection, and shared experiences. One day, Robert surprised her with a proposal. It wasn't extravagant, not in the way most people would expect from someone of his wealth. No, Robert's proposal was quiet, intimate, and filled with a sincerity that took Dorothy's breath away. They were sitting in the garden, the evening sun casting a soft glow over the flowers, when Robert turned to her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Dorothy," he said softly, taking her hand in his. "I don't have grand gestures, but I want you to know that I love you. I always have. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Dorothy was taken aback. It was so simple, so genuine, that it moved her more than anything elaborate ever could. She had never imagined this moment, not like this. There were no diamonds, no lavish ceremony, just the man she had always loved, offering her a chance to start anew. "Yes," Dorothy said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Yes, Robert, I will marry you." The simplicity of the moment made it all the more perfect. There were no grand plans, no elaborate celebrations, just the two of them, standing together in the garden, ready to begin a new chapter of their lives. It was everything Dorothy had ever wanted, a simple, true love that needed no adornment. Not long after the proposal, as Dorothy and Robert's life together began to settle into a quiet routine, the first signs of intrusion appeared. It came in the form of a sudden visit from David and Emma. Dorothy hadn't expected to hear from them again, especially after the way David had reacted when she moved in with Robert, but there they were, standing at the door one afternoon, their faces carefully neutral, yet something in their eyes betrayed their intentions. Robert had been out for a while, handling business matters, leaving Dorothy alone in the house. When the doorbell rang, she wasn't sure what to expect, but seeing her son and his wife standing there, looking almost too polished, made her uneasy. There was no warmth in their eyes, no genuine joy to see her, just a cold kind of curiosity, as though they were studying her to see what they could gain. "Mom," David said, his voice flat, almost too casual, "we came to check on you. I see you've made quite a life for yourself here." With Robert, Dorothy's stomach churned. There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that made her feel like an object, something to be scrutinized, analyzed, possibly even claimed. His concern wasn't for her well-being, it was for something else entirely. Emma stood behind David, her expression tightly controlled, but Dorothy noticed the way her eyes flickered over the house. She wasn't looking at Dorothy with the same warmth she had in the past. No, Emma was sizing up the place, as if calculating its worth, evaluating whether there was anything of value to be gained from Dorothy's presence in Robert's life. "We were just worried, you know," Emma said, stepping forward slightly, her smile a little too wide. "It must be so unexpected, all this. Moving in with Robert, starting over like this." Dorothy's gut told her exactly what this was about. They weren't here because they cared. They were here because they wanted something, either information, or a chance to worm their way back into her life in a way that would benefit them. She could see the desire in their eyes, a need to reclaim control over her choices. "I'm fine, thank you," Dorothy said, keeping her voice firm, though there was a tremor of unease that she couldn't quite hide. "Robert and I are doing well, we're happy." David exchanged a look with Emma, a silent communication that Dorothy knew all too well. He wasn't giving up on the idea of fixing things, making her see that she should have stayed with him, with his life, but it was clear now, it wasn't about her happiness, it was about something else, something he felt entitled to. "Well," David said, his voice tightening slightly, "if you ever change your mind, you know where we are." Emma nodded, her expression unreadable, before both of them turned to leave, disappearing as suddenly as they had arrived. Dorothy stood in the doorway, watching them retreat, and for the first time, she didn't feel the same sense of obligation to fix things with them. She had a choice now, a real one, and it didn't involve bending to their will, or living a life based on their expectations. She had her own path, her own future, and with Robert beside her, she felt strong enough to stand by it. The encounter with David and Emma left Dorothy feeling uneasy, but it also solidified something she hadn't realized she needed: boundaries. She had spent so many years accommodating her son, bending to his demands, but now, with Robert's unwavering support, she felt a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. It wasn't long before David and Emma made another attempt to insert themselves into her life. This time, it was more calculated: an invitation to dinner at a restaurant. One of those places where the rich and powerful gathered, where appearances mattered more than anything else. Dorothy knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to keep her in their world, trying to pull her back into the role of a mother who was at their beck and call, the one who existed solely to fulfill their needs and desires. But Robert wasn't having it. He had been watching the interactions between Dorothy and her son closely, and he could see the manipulation at play, the subtle coercion, the unspoken expectations, and he wasn't about to let Dorothy fall back into the same old pattern. When David called to remind Dorothy of the dinner, Robert answered the phone before she could. Dorothy wasn't sure what had been said, but when she saw Robert hang up, there was a look in his eyes that made her breath catch. "That was David," Robert said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "He's not invited to dinner tonight." Dorothy's heart skipped. "Robert, I know," Robert interrupted gently but firmly. "I won't stand by and watch you be used by him anymore. He doesn't get to dictate your life, Dorothy. You've spent far too many years living on his terms, and I won't allow it." Dorothy was taken aback by his intensity, but in a strange way. It felt good to know that someone had her back, truly had her back. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of others' expectations, trying to please them at the cost of her own happiness. But Robert was different. He was offering her something she hadn't known she needed: respect, love, and the strength to say no when necessary. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Robert reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "You don't have to do anything alone anymore, Dorothy." And just like that, Dorothy knew she had made the right choice. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even her son, make her feel guilty for choosing a life that brought her peace. With Robert by her side, she had everything she needed, everything she had longed for. The days that followed were quieter, the tension from David and Emma's visits slowly fading into the background. As Dorothy settled more comfortably into her life with Robert, it wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was real. And that, for Dorothy, was all she had ever needed. But the shadow of her son still lingered. Despite the firm boundaries Robert had set, David's influence had not entirely faded. Dorothy had always prided herself on being a good mother, on doing what was best for her child, but the reality of their strained relationship had left her heartbroken. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unsaid between them, a final conversation that needed to happen before she could move on completely. One evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills that surrounded Robert's estate, Dorothy made a decision. She couldn't keep avoiding the truth, not anymore. She had lived so long trying to keep the peace, trying to make everyone happy, that she had forgotten about her own voice. It was time to confront her son, to tell him what she had never been able to say before. The phone call to David was short, but the words that came from her mouth were the ones she had been holding inside for years. "David," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I've spent my whole life trying to make you happy, trying to be the mother you wanted me to be. But I've realized that I can't keep living for you. I can't keep giving pieces of myself away, hoping you'll finally see me, hear me. I've done everything I could for you. And now, it's time for me to live my own life." There was silence on the other end of the line, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Dorothy didn't wait for a response. She had said what needed to be said. She had laid bare her heart, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the burden of guilt that had held her captive for so long. "I don't expect you to understand, David, but I'm done. I won't let you manipulate me anymore. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for my own peace." With those words, Dorothy ended the call. And for the first time in years, she felt a sense of liberation. She had faced the truth, spoken it aloud, and in doing so, she had set herself free. There was no turning back, no more trying to please everyone else. As she put the phone down, Dorothy looked up at Robert, who had been watching her quietly from across the room. She could see the pride in his eyes, the understanding that said he knew what it had cost her to speak those words. "I did it," Dorothy said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I told him the truth." Robert walked over to her, his arms enveloping her in a comforting embrace. "You did it, Dorothy, and I'm so proud of you." In that moment, Dorothy realized that this was what it had all been leading to. This was her moment of freedom, of reclaiming her life. She wasn't a victim of her past anymore. She was a woman who had found her strength, who had found her voice, and who was no longer afraid to use it. Dorothy's life began to settle into a rhythm that felt both comforting and exhilarating. At 72, she had never imagined herself starting over, much less finding a new lease on life. But here she was, embracing a future she had once thought was behind her, and with it, a sense of freedom she had long since given up on. Each day, she found herself becoming more involved in the small joys of life. She took up hobbies she had neglected for years: painting, gardening, even learning to play the piano again. Something she had once loved, but had abandoned when life had demanded too much of her. The house, which had once felt so overwhelming, now felt like a sanctuary. A place where Dorothy could finally breathe and be herself without the constant weight of others' expectations. Evenings were spent with Robert, sitting side by side on the porch as the sun set, their conversations shifting from light-hearted to deep, from dreams of the future to shared memories of the past. It was a life Dorothy had never imagined she would have, but one she had always wanted, a life filled with love, peace, and the freedom to be who she truly was. But it wasn't just Robert's love that had changed everything. It was the love Dorothy had rediscovered for herself. She no longer looked to others for validation or approval. She no longer allowed herself to be defined by the roles others had imposed on her. She was Dorothy, a woman who had lived, who had suffered, and who had finally found a way to thrive. As she sat on the porch, watching the stars slowly fill the sky, Dorothy couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. There had been so much pain, so much loss, but now there was peace, there was joy, and for the first time in many years, Dorothy knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As time passed, Dorothy's transformation became even more apparent. She had stopped waiting for someone to make her happy, and had learned to cultivate her own happiness, bit by bit. Each morning, she awoke with a sense of gratitude, a quiet appreciation for the life she had now. It wasn't a life of grandeur or perfection, but it was real, and that was all that mattered to her. Her days were filled with the small, meaningful moments that brought her joy. She enjoyed the fresh flowers from the garden, the smell of freshly baked bread, the laughter that echoed through the house when Robert played the piano and she joined him in singing old songs they both loved. It was a life of simplicity, but it was hers, and it was enough. For the first time in years, Dorothy could look at herself in the mirror and see someone she was proud of. She wasn't the woman who had been torn apart by her past, by the mistakes and regrets she had carried for so long. She was a woman who had faced the truth, who had found the strength to let go of what no longer served her, and who had built something new from the ground up. Her relationship with Robert continued to blossom, and though it was far from the fairy tale that many people imagined, it was beautiful in its own quiet way. There were no grand gestures, no flashy displays of affection, just a people who loved each other deeply, who found joy in the simplicity of being together. Dorothy no longer felt the weight of loneliness that had plagued her for so long. She had found her place in the world, not because of anyone else, but because she had allowed herself to live for herself. She had finally learned to embrace the happiness that had always been within her reach, but that she had never believed she deserved. And in this new chapter of her life, Dorothy realized that happiness wasn't something to be found in the future or in the validation of others. It was something to be built in the present, from the inside out. It was a choice, a way of living, and she had chosen it. As Dorothy sat in the quiet comfort of her home, a peaceful smile played on her lips, a smile that had eluded her for most of her life. She gazed out at the view from the porch, where the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the world. It was a moment of reflection, one she had longed for during the years of struggle and heartache. The love she had once shared with Robert, the love that had been buried under layers of time and circumstance, had blossomed once again. But it wasn't just their love that had been rekindled. It was Dorothy's love for herself, a love that had been buried deep within her for so long, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Looking back on her life, Dorothy realized that she had lived through more than she had ever expected. She had experienced the highs of motherhood, the deep heartache of loss, and the quiet, painful moments of rejection and loneliness. But through it all, she had found the strength to keep going. She had never given up, not entirely, even when it seemed like all was lost. And now, here she was, at 72, having found a happiness that was all her own, a love that had waited 55 years to bloom. It wasn't the love she had expected, and it wasn't the love she had envisioned all those years ago, but it was the love she had needed all along. A love that had not been rushed, not forced, but one that had grown slowly and steadily, like a flower that waited for the right moment to bloom. She thought about the life she had shared with Robert in the past few months, the way they had slowly built something new together, without the pressure of expectations or the shadows of the past. It was simple, but it was real. It was everything Dorothy had ever wanted, and it had come to her when she least expected it. She thought about her son David, and the relationship they had once shared. It hurt, the distance between them, but Dorothy no longer felt the need to fix everything. She had made her peace with it. David had his life, and she had hers. They were no longer bound by the expectations that had once defined them. And so, as the sun set and the stars began to appear, Dorothy whispered to herself, "This is my life now, and it's beautiful." The love that had waited for so long was now hers, not just from Robert, but from herself, and that, more than anything, was the greatest gift she could have ever received. As we come to the end of this journey, I want to leave you with something to think about. Life isn't always about the perfect moments or the grand stories we read in books. It's about the small victories, the quiet moments of peace we find after the storms. It's about the courage to start over, even when we think it's too late. Dorothy's story reminds us that no matter how many twists and turns we face, there's always a chance to rebuild, to find love, and to reclaim our happiness. So, as you reflect on your own life, remember this: you have the power to write your own story. And no matter where you've been, it's never too late to begin again. If you've enjoyed this story, I'd love for you to join me on this journey. Please, subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking together. And let me know where you're watching from. Comment below with your city, because every place has a story to tell, just like Dorothy's. Thank you for being part of this. I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter.